With question 55 of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia, we begin a new treatise, and thanks be to God for that, because I made it pretty clear that last treatise on habits was really challenging, and I think this one is going to be not quite so challenging. This is the treatise on good habits, or the virtues, and you can see it's Prima Secunda, questions 55 through 70, so about 16 questions, beginning with virtues as to their essence. So these four articles are basically getting to the bottom of what are virtues and how are they related to habits and the end and the object and that kind of thing. And also keep in mind that the whole Summa is really about exodus and reditus. We exit from God, we return back to God. And one of the key ways that God kind of pulls us back to himself is by attracting us to the good. And so the world is good, all creatures are good, everything that God creates is good, but sometimes they're so good that we are tempted to put them above God. And so the virtues help us to kind of balance things and be moderate in our attraction toward the good, or in our repulsion from evil as well. So again, four articles here: whether human virtue is a habit. Now remember, flashback, nightmares from the habits. And by the way, before we get into this, since it's a new treatise, he has a little introductory paragraph, which I'll read. He says, "We come now to the consideration of habits specifically, and since habits, as we have said, are divided into good and bad, we must speak in the first place of good habits, which are virtues, and of other matters connected with them, namely the gifts, beatitudes, and fruits, in the second place of bad habits, namely of vices and sins." And so we're going to be on the topic of virtues for quite some time in this Prima Secunda. And so the first article says whether human virtue is a habit. He says virtue denotes a certain perfection of a power. Now, a thing's perfection is considered chiefly in regard to its end, but the end of power is act. Wherefore, power is said to be perfect according as it is determinate to its act. So there are certain actions or things that we do that would be regulated and associated with virtue. Now, there are some powers which of themselves are determinate to their acts. For instance, the active natural powers, okay, the things that we just do naturally, the things that brute creatures do just naturally, the birds fly, the beavers build dams. Those are just natural acts. And therefore, these natural powers are in themselves called virtues. Okay, anything that's conducive to one's nature would be a virtue, but of course with irrational creatures, it'd be a very different kind of virtue than what we're talking about. And he makes that distinction. He says, but the rational powers which are proper to man are not determinate to one particular action, but are inclined indifferently to many, and they are determinate to acts by means of habits, as is clear from what we have said. Therefore, human virtues are habits. All right. So when we have different choices that we can make and go in different directions, the virtues are what help us be directed to the good, because there are contingencies and there are decisions that we can make. Article 2, whether human virtue is an operative habit. Is it something that we do? Virtue, from the very nature of the word, implies some perfection of power, which he already said. Wherefore, since power, the one Latin word potentia, is rendered potentiality in the first case and power in the second, is of two kinds, namely power in reference to being and power in reference to act. Okay, so we are a certain thing, the ontological, being of us being human beings, right? And the perfection of each is called a virtue. But power in reference to being is on the part of matter. Okay, it's what we are, how we're constructed, I guess you could say, which is potential being, whereas power in reference to act is on the part of the form, which is the principle of action, since everything acts insofar as it is in act. And if you remember way back a long time ago, when we were in Prima Pars, we were talking about how important form and matter is going to be in the Summa. If you don't understand form and matter, it's really going to be difficult to understand the Summa. Of course, Aristotle said form and matter come together to create a substance, and much of modern philosophy, especially like empiricism, denies that substance even exists. Okay, so that's why this whole form and matter and substance is very important. Now, man is so constituted that the body holds the place of matter, the soul of form. The body indeed the body indeed man has in common with other animals, and the same is to be said of the forces which are common to the soul and body. And only those forces which are proper to the soul, namely the rational forces, belong to man alone. Okay, so animals have souls, plants have souls, trees have souls, but they're not rational souls. That's what he's saying. And therefore, human virtue of which we are speaking now cannot belong to the body, but belongs only to that which is proper to the soul of the human being. Wherefore, human virtue does not imply reference to being, but rather to act. Consequently, it is essential to human virtue to be an operative habit. Okay, the things that we do, the decisions we make, and he's saying it's really related more to the rational aspect of our soul. Article 3 is very short. Whether human virtue is a good habit, virtue implies a perfection of power, which he's now said 3 times. Wherefore, the virtue of a thing is fixed by the limit of its power. Now, the limit of any power must needs be good, for all evil implies defect. Wherefore, Dionysius says that every evil is a weakness. And for this reason, the virtue of a thing must be regarded in reference to good. Therefore, human virtue, which is an operative habit, is a good habit, productive of good works. All right, so the last article is really interesting because he's going to define what virtue is. And he already, because I'm only reading the corpus of these, he already defines it in a previous part of this article. So I'm going to read the definition that he goes by. And he says, and this is from Augustine, he says, a virtue is a good quality of the mind by which we live righteously, of which no one can make bad use, which God works in us without us. Now, you're thinking like, God works in us without us. Do we not have any say in the virtues? He's going to qualify that in the last paragraph. But what he's going to do is he's going to dissect this definition and talk about every single part of it. It's pretty interesting. All right, so once again, I'll just read it real quickly. Virtue is a good quality of the mind by which we live righteously, of which no one can make bad use, which God works in us without us. He says this definition comprises perfectly the whole essential notion of virtue, for the perfect essential notion of anything is gathered from all of its causes. Now, the above definition comprises all the causes of virtue, for the formal cause of virtue, as of everything, is gathered from its genus and difference, when it defined as a good quality. For quality is the genus of virtue, and the difference good. But the definition would be even more suitable if for quality we substitute habit, which is the proximate genus. So Thomas is saying, yeah, I like it, but I wish habit was in instead of quality. Okay, so we can change that. Now, virtue has no matter out of which it is formed, as neither has any other accident, but it has matter about which it is concerned, and matter in which it exists, namely the subject, right, us. The matter about which virtue is concerned is its object, and this could not be included in the above definition because the object fixes the virtue on a certain species, and here we are giving the definition of virtue in general. As for material cause, we have the subject, which is mentioned when we say that virtue is a good quality of the mind. All right, so he's saying here every particular virtue is going to have a different object, and so you can't put that in the definition because you got to be more general about it, right? So finally, the end of virtue, since it is an operative habit, is operation. But it must be observed that some operative habits are always referred to evil as vicious habits. Others are sometimes referred to good. Sometimes to evil, for instance, opinion is referred both to the true and to the untrue, whereas virtue is a habit which is always referred to good. And so the distinction of virtue from those habits which are always referred to evil is expressed by the words, by which we live righteously. And its distinction from those habits which are sometimes directed unto good, sometimes unto evil, in the words, of which no one makes bad use. So again, he's dissecting this. Okay, finally, the part at the end of the definition about which God works in us without us, he says, lastly, God is the efficient cause of infused virtue, to which this definition applies, and this is expressed in the words, which God works in us without us. If we omit the phrase, the remainder of the definition will apply to all virtues in general, which are acquired or are infused, because some virtues are not infused. Many of the moral virtues, now God can infuse any virtue he wants, But most of the virtues outside of the theological virtues are not infused in us, but they are acquired and they can be improved, as we learned with habits. But we'll get more into that as we go through this treatise on the good habits, virtues in their essence. So hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for joining me as we go through the Summa Theologia, one question at a time. God bless you.